My name is Frank Heemskerk. I'm the Executive Director for the Dutch Constituency, which consists of a lot of countries that are non-Dutch. Georgia, Armenia, in the Caucasus, and of course many that have been making a transition. And what I really liked, Aleksandr, of Alek, I should say, in your book is also, I think it was on page 11, transition, question mark, transition from, question mark, transition to, question mark. And we're going to have an opening statement by you. Aleksandr Gevorkyan is Associate Professor of Economics at the St. John's University of New York in New York City, and has a wide range of experience in both research and in teaching. The floor will be yours for about 10 minutes, and then Hans Timmer, the Chief Economist of the DISCUSSANT region, will respond. And maybe one opening sentence also from my side is what I also liked in your book was many of the historical references. Page 54, I think it was on the and also a summary of the Washington Consensus in the 90s. You can find it on page 149. Although there, I think the Washington Consensus has changed. It's no longer privatize, liberalize everything you have. I mean, we've been way past. We're way past that right now. And the summary is that and in your book says in page 189 there's a different path for many countries, and I was wondering whether you could say something also about, let's say, the way you think countries are developing and what are the drivers for some of the slow reformers, some of the speedy reformers, some of the non-reformers, some of, let's say, Europe making a choice also for European integrations, others are not. So looking forward for an interesting discussion. Next 10 minutes are for you, then Hans will respond, and then I suggest that you respond to Hans, and then the floor is open.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Frank. Thanks. Is it on now? Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for the introduction and the invitation, I should say, as well. And I'm also thankful to everyone who's here. Now we know the secret lunch meetings. But again, thanks, Hans, for agreeing to discuss this project. But most of all, thank you for Otaviano Canuto. His inspiration was instrumental in getting the whole book done towards the end. But I have to stay to 10 minutes. I have much more to say, and I prepared much more to say. Now, I have a few slides, but I'll try to limit it to a couple of slides. And as someone, I should talk about probably where my interest for this book comes from. Teaching macroeconomic development across, now at St. John's, but before that a few other places in New York, I would run into the same problem, and I have it. I'll just put it all up here in the interest of time. The problem was that we would teach it as just a component, as a side note, especially in macro books on, well, there was socialism and now there's capitalism, and without much significance and paying much attention to the whole economic history connection and the connection between the theory, you mentioned Washington Consensus, and macro policy as well. But what really was the tipping point for me was at one of the conferences, one of the presentations, it was the flip-a-switch attitude. In fact, there was a question somebody asked, well, why are you telling us about all these problems in the 90s? It was just a transition, right? And so I almost lost it right there. So I'll skip the map view. I do this for my students. The end result was that I would not call it a transition, but in fact, it was a fundamental structural change, both in economics and social organization, politics, culture, you name it. And that's what needs to be most importantly emphasized and appreciated. In the book, I do have to reference the studies that were popular at the time, that were influential, but by no means it's sort of putting a blame of some sort. There's obviously, the aim of the book is actually to present the systemic view of how we got to that point, to that stage when all that happened. So towards the end, I'll mention probably a couple of lessons. Let me skip this, but talk about, was it inevitable? This is a very general graph that just shows the magnitude of the decline for the average, and I look at 29 countries, specifically part of the socialist or the Soviet system in Eastern Europe and former Soviet Union. And so the collapse was massive, but so was also a much longer recovery on average, and I have a couple of case studies and specific references in the book. Well, was it inevitable? That's a big question, because towards the 70s and in the case of the Soviet Union, towards the late 70s in Eastern Europe, it was sort of a contractive cycle, kind of anticipation building up. There was a need for I would say reinvestment and reinvestment in new technology and upgrading the capital funds. Yet that was very difficult to be achieved, right? And I think that was one of the structural problems that would emerge later in the 90s. So I have a lot of epigraphs in my book. This one is on from Churchill. The buildings, first we build the buildings and then they define us, kind of like that, right? But this is an interesting picture to me. What I mentioned just now about the contractive cycle, that by 1980s, almost at the peak of its combined ideological and macroeconomic sort of achievement, the socialist economic model was already struggling with maintaining the same growth rates and same path of development. And partially you could say the inability with the problems with the consumer market development. But then, so that was first phase. And the second phase was the systemic collapse of the 90s, which was a trigger, I would argue, but not this sort of, we blame shock therapy. Yes, there were problems, but it really triggered what was already hidden and what was about to erupt, I think, at the bottom. I'll skip the picture, but I'll just mention that, of course, by the time we have the mid-1980s, the idea was not to dismantle the system, but to reinforce it, right? And it would be coming from this view of, well, we just need to rebuild the top without and then gradual sort of minimal changes at the bottom. In your question, Frank, you mentioned something about the speed of reform and EU integration, and I think this chart that I also kind of dug out of some archives might help explain the degree to which Eastern European, Central European economies were in relative terms, and whatever I'm saying, if I miss it, it's sort of omit to specify it explicitly, it's all in relative terms. Eastern Europe relative to the former Soviet Union, the degree to which Eastern Europe was industrialized more recently is significant. And in fact, the competition between the countries in Eastern Europe with each other in the common socialist market was significant. Kind of producing similar items, but with slightly different quality and quantity. Well, I think I would argue that helped to, if we we can refer to this as faster reforms or more successful outcomes, but at the end of the day, better integration probably was with the Western European economy. And I'll skip this, but I already mentioned this again in the interest of time, but if anyone likes any of the pictures, I'm happy to go back. So what's more recently, I think this is an important slide to focus on, and that is if we look at specific countries, the dark bars represent the 2000 GDP per capita, and the lighter ones are 2016, and the flat line is the index of 1989. And so if the promise of the market reforms was to create prosperity on at least the superficial average level at least, as late as 2000 or as early as 2000, it was not really happening for a majority of the countries. And only by mid-2000s, we start seeing those countries exceeding the 1989 levels. And I think that's a significant sort of story that needs to be, again, taken into account when we discuss and we talk macro policy, especially if we have some general statements in terms of macro policy. Sort of country specifics matter apparently significantly here. Let me skip this one. There's some interest in general academic literature on the countries of what it's an uncomfortable term referred to as transitional periphery. And one might look at the Caucasus and Georgia and Armenia, for example, on this table, with some improvements in social indicators, but also still, relatively gradual improvements than we would have expected. And I think the story repeats itself if we look at another way of kind of approaching this and assessing the problem. Like kind of this one speaks about the shadow economy and in the formal sector. In some ways, actually, the perceptions are stronger than the reality, and that's what I'm trying to address in the book as well. We have a narrative that we think we know, but then if we'll go into the archives and start working with numbers or data sources that are more recent, something else emerges. And in this case, both countries are doing better than Europe, Central Asia average on some of the measures. For example, the last one, % of firms identifying corruption as a major obstacle. So these are all interesting stories and narratives, and I try to pull them together in the book in a bit more systematized approach. So let me just quickly talk about the structure and then 2 minutes on the conclusions. And the structure is the following. There are 10 chapters, which were initially meant to be 15. And the entire project was to only take a year or so, but it ended up being a 5-year exploration. Here's how it happened. You go into this very ambitious and you say, I'm going to give something to my students to work with, and that will be great. And then you start reading, and obviously there are other people who have worked on the topic, and there's enormous amount of research that is coming out, and including from the bank, which is extremely helpful, especially having access to the data. So I had to restructure. And the first 2 chapters are purely informational. The first one looks at the first one just identifies the region. I think that's also very important because the word transition is misused quite a bit. Then the second one gets into a bit of, well, what you mentioned, transition to, from, and how. Is it a transition? So there's something about that. At the time, the discussions were something, I would simplify it in the classroom, I would say something about the textbook kind of implementation of the macro policy. And then I follow the advice of Aleksandr Gevorkyan, who said, paraphrasing, anyone studying the current situation in Russia in 1940s must really start with a history of the economy and history of Russia. So I go back to 1861, and I start there. And I tried to approach this as a complex development in terms of the mix of politics, society, and the economy. I do not separate them because we can kind of try to isolate the technical aspects of the economy, but it's the policymakers who make the decisions in the end. So kind of that's what Chapter 3 gets into and leads up to how the Soviet Union model emerged and the, for example, new economic plan that was introduced in the 20s, and then in the industrialization, and then the war economy in Chapter 4. And I benefited significantly from the work of Mark Harrison on the statistics and the analysis of that data at the time. I introduced the case of Eastern Europe more with much more background and discussion in Chapter 5, when sort of very simplistically speaking, the world is being divided after World War II. And it was interesting to contrast if we just speak about industrialization and agricultural reforms in the Soviet Union in the 30s and then in Eastern Europe through late 40s and 50s. In relative terms, again, not making any blank statements, but in relative terms, Eastern European experience was softer. And that has to be also appreciated. It's important then to talk about the socialist economic model, so that's the rest, the 70s, the 80s, and then leading towards the perestroika. What was interesting then was the experience of what commonly referred to, and we can agree or disagree, market socialism, or different economic patterns of development, even though sort of politically we are talking about similar entity, one entity. Chapter 7 is the one that sort of tackles the whole Washington Consensus and the ideas that were popular at the time. Well, we had to go through that, obviously, in that discussion. And the 3 pillars, right? Of course, liberalization, privatization, and stabilization are addressed most directly there. What was surprising then, would be surprising then to discover then, was the increase in social pressures, right, and the increase of outward migration, the poverty rates, the income inequality. So that is addressed in Chapter 8. And then bringing the discussion more closer, the early 2000s that saw very strong growth, especially in resource-enriched countries. And then Chapter 10 is more of the different narratives. And this is what I think, important, is that we may have approached, or sort of the profession, the economics profession, may have approached the countries in the early 90s as similar, with similar solutions. At the end of the day, we're getting different narratives. And the reason why this is important, I think, is because if we're trying to understand what's going on now, that memory, that legacy is very strong. But if I may, just 2 more minutes.
Yeah, continue, and then also please focus a little bit more for the next 2 minutes also on Chapter 10.
Okay, yes. So that's what it is. So Chapter 10 is my long view, what I would refer to, and that is, and I have to refer to classical literature for that because that stays relative all the time. So first, the general how to analyze. I think there are 3 key pillars, and that is the institutional reform, the social welfare, and the competitiveness or macroeconomic structures. I kind of drew those lines trying to come up with a spiral change, but it doesn't have to be even. And what that means is that there may be improvement in one aspect. It doesn't necessarily mean there may be equal improvements in other aspects. And that's also important. We could see strong growth in one case, but sort of institutionally, and there's some questions about this, for example, in some Eastern European countries with the consistency with the European Union goals and so on. So that, I think, is important to keep in mind as a general picture. But then, how do we read this transformation? Was the goal to get, and I'm paraphrasing a colleague who also inspired some of the work on this, it was the goal to achieve higher income standards. If so, then we're not there yet. In most cases, with few exceptions approaching, but in most cases, per capita income levels are still far from the rich countries' averages. I mentioned the inequality. Well, that worsened. Not that things were great before, but the sharpening inequality is the result of what took place in the 90s and the redistribution and how it was handled. So the dark bars represent roughly 40% going to the top income. And these are all World Bank numbers, so I'm relying on that. So my conclusion then towards Chapter 10 is that with all that, there's something significant to take away, and that is the scale of the change that resulted, or we take as a result, was unprecedented. The freedoms in economic terms and political terms were unprecedented as well. In some ways, it may be accidental progress, but in some ways, as we spoke with Otaviano some time ago, we don't have a counterfactual. We don't know how things would have developed if we tried something different. But I would also point to the role of the initial conditions and the differences between the countries. And what sort of pushing for, when we talk about institutional reforms, for example, something that needs to be understood is that it doesn't happen overnight. And there are countries now undergoing changes, including political changes, and the expectation is building up that tomorrow will be the best of the days, and unfortunately it takes time to build institutions. And some of the reformers realized that later, but they wrote that in some of their work. What to mention here is that history matters, and we have to appreciate this, sort of the momentum that we are at which now compared to the drops and the sort of destruction of the 90s. And I would emphasize this especially in the smaller countries, what I refer to as the transitional periphery. Sort of the expectation, of course, is to have greater and prosperous life, but things could have been much more worse, I guess. That's one of the other conclusions. So, to conclude, then the reality is that while the past remains challenging to accept, the future is always bright. It's the present that is unclear, and it's important lessons that we take from this that will shape the rest of it. Okay, so thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. And you didn't get anything to drink, I see. So maybe
I have water.
Oh, you have water? Yeah. Maybe Ada, could you maybe get an yeah?
There's a glass.
Thanks. Hans, floor is yours.
Thanks so much for joining us and for the presentation. Indeed, it is a very ambitious project. So congratulations with the book. It's incredibly rich and broad. You can learn a lot from it. I understand that because of this session, you can even buy it with discount. So don't let that opportunity go. It starts in the 19th century. It goes all the way to today. So that's very broad. It goes beyond economic variables. That makes it very rich and broad, and it doesn't avoid complexity. So in many occasions, you see the realizations that countries are different, that developments are not black and white. So that makes it not only rich, but also very relevant. There are many things that you can use to address current topical issues. One thing that I found nice was the discussion of sectoral patterns and sectoral policies in the early Soviet Union, the relative prices between rural products and industrial products in cities had huge consequences. It favored the cities. When you read about the policies to build up very quickly the heavy industry, which was very different from what happened in China, where there was a focus on light manufacturing, labor-intensive manufacturing. So there's a lot about the sectoral policies that is still relevant, I think. The whole discussion on the shock therapy is incredibly relevant now for Uzbekistan. We try to learn a lot from the mistakes of the past and to see how you can avoid the big downturn and focus on the low-hanging fruits and advances for people instead of going first through the deep trough. And the focus on non-economic variables, incredibly important in our current work also. We try to understand what determines the perceptions, the anxiety that we are seeing in many countries, and we realize that you can't just understand that by looking at our standard economic variables. There's a lot more that determines the anxiety of people. Wonderful, you should all read it. I will do what every discussant always does. I will ask for even more and for a broader perspective. And I think there is a great opportunity to go even beyond the transition economies and to look at overall global trends. And I think when you do that, at least with hindsight, you can answer your question, was it inevitable? And I think, yes, it was inevitable with hindsight. Not so much because every economic system, every set of policies runs into its own limitations when you reach a higher level of development. It is not just because the centrally planned economies couldn't provide the services anymore that were demanded at a certain time, but it just fitted the global developments that required changes in all countries, almost irrespective of their level of development. So if you think about it, after the 1930s, then the role of governments all over the world increased enormously, both to stabilize the economies, but also to get a much larger grip on economic structure. And after the Second World War, you saw that in all parts of the world you had an inward-looking rebuilding of societies. You had import substitution in Latin America. In Europe, there was a lot of price regulation. There were capital controls. You saw, obviously, in China that it shifted towards centrally planned economy, and then later the African countries adopted that model also. So it was much broader than just in Central Europe or the Soviet Union. There was a whole wave of strong influence of governments. And all over the world during the 1970s with the oil crisis that ran into its own constraints. And then all over the world during the 1980s, you saw that economies were opening up. It was true in Latin America. It was true in Europe, where suddenly you had capital movements coming. It was true in China in the 1980s, opening up to global markets. In the 1990s, it was true in Africa. And so in that sense, what happened in the Soviet Union and in Central Europe completely fitted that picture, which you saw, as I said, at many levels of development. And then after that, you mentioned in the book the crisis of 98 in Russia, the financial crisis, but that was not unique at all. You had at the same time the Asian financial crisis. You had the Swedish banking crisis. You had the Mexico crisis in 2001. You had Turkey and Argentina. It was all a reaction of opening up capital markets and then ultimately running into problems. And if you extend it to today, after the global financial crisis of 2008, you see again everywhere the same kind of developments, which we tend to call a move towards more populism, anxiety about fairness of societies. And you see that in Central Europe, but you see it in Western Europe also. You see it in the United States. So that is actually my plea. If you take such a broad approach, trying to understand in an historical perspective these big changes, these transformations, as you... sorry about that. These fundamental changes, then I think we can learn from that, not just for the transition economies, but actually for many other economies also. And perhaps it's not as radical, but if you see what is happening in some countries of Western Europe at the moment, if you are looking at what is happening in the United States, those are fundamental changes. And somehow there is what the Germans call the Zeitgeist, the spirit of time, that is as important as the domestic development. So my plea is broaden it even up. And despite the fact that everything is diverse, it is striking how common some of these themes are that you are describing. But thanks so much for the book.
Thank you, Hans. You was about to say something nice about Otaviano, but then you interrupted because you wanted to squeeze through the time. But I suggest that you still take the floor before he can say something in response to you as well, because you're one of the drivers behind this event as well.
Yes, sorry. Thank you. Thank you indeed for giving me the chance. Thanks, Alec. I know Alec for some time. We did even do a couple of works on emerging markets and so on. And I had the opportunity to read an early draft, which I benefit substantially before doing my first travel to Eastern Europe outside Russia in my 15 years here, and it was quite useful. I learned a lot, particularly on the history. 2 points that I would like to make before I open. Alec, definitely I subscribe, and you have a point in stressing the simplicity with which the cookie-cutter approach was taken to the region based on simplistic mantras, thinking that they would generate spark results and so on. On the other hand, I would say that maybe too much emphasis is made on that. Definitely, we all agree about the heterogeneity in the region. Our trip was to a subset of Eastern Europe, which is relatively homogeneous within itself, but containing so much heterogeneity. We went to Belarus, Ukraine, and Georgia. And while Belarus is an amusement park, with due respect, with Soviet Union conserved there on artificially, because were it not for the subsidies from Russia, it would crumble down. But 3 different experiences. And my point is the following. Beyond what happened in the 90s in the application of a simplistic package, you had underlying in all these countries institutions in a broad sense, structure of power, which one way or another remained or retained the command over allocation of resource afterwards. So maybe the answers to the questions that you were looking for cannot be answered simply by looking at the 90s. You have to look at the nature of the institutions, whether they are extractive or inclusive, to use Semoglu's binary classification and so on. So following your own words, the history in each of these countries matter more than what happened in the 90s. That's my first point. Whereas you seem to be focused on hammering on the Washington Consensus, which is, a long time ago. It's a pity that you don't refer to it. Even Denny Roderick wrote the extended Washington Consensus, in which he outlined the Decalogue, and then he outlines everything that would be necessary for that to work out. And you look at there, and you see the role of institutions and so on. So the Washington Consensus as such is a simplistic approach. Is that for a long time ago? And I would suggest that you pursue in that regard in between the narrative that you develop for each of the countries. And again, I learned a lot by reading and for you. The next stage would be to approach the institutions, the underlying structure of powers in these societies, rather than putting the blame on the stupidity of adopting simplistic schemes. And I have a question that I would also ask Hans and his deep knowledge. Underlying the heterogeneity among Belarus, Georgia, and Ukraine, we saw the common feature, as well approached in your latest report, of an integration of the youth through the technology to the West. And one of the questions that we always asked the young people with whom we went was to what extent they were connected with the rest of the societies. And I had the impression that they weren't. They happened to be in Georgia or happened to be in Ukraine accidentally or Belarus. How this is possible? The authorities, local authorities, are looking the other way. Has this the potential to disrupt the existing structure? How do you see that? Again, thank you.
Question. I'll give you the floor to quick response, and then we open it up for a few more questions, either to Alec, to Otaviano, or to Hans.
So I'll first probably address Hans' point, and the major point is the broader view, which I agree with. But I just think it would be such a monumental project to accomplish that properly, with all attention to the details, and because the literature is so rich. So perhaps in the future, but for now, the aim was really just to provide a reference to this part of the world, within it included references to more readings if someone wanted to pursue any specific topic more in a more focused and in a more narrowed way. But and I have to kind of come back to it in a moment, but because it is in my mind connected to Otaviano's point on institutions, I do talk about Washington Consensus, but really in the beginning and in the because I do understand that sort of we use that term to describe the general set of policies that were introduced in the 90s and implemented. But I do also bring up Roderick's clarification of things and others who wrote at the time. And I make another point, which was brought up by those who stood at the forefront, the Yegor Gaidar, who wrote on the need for reforms, and most urgently in the early 90s, obviously leading that transformation. His last book, from which I borrow half of the title, The Long View, where he says that institutions do not just grow up, well, I'm paraphrasing, but do not just grow up out of nowhere, right? It takes time to build them. It takes time to develop them. And that's why I thought the historical approach was important, to illustrate how much deep-seated history is in there, and the map then helps me to, at least in my classroom, to explain to students that we're dealing with a very unique set of countries. Politically, there may have been similarities, but very unique, and this uniqueness continues on to now, which is illustrated in your experience. So they're unique because these are the countries I'm talking about. But to Hans's point, it is part of the global trend in terms of the government's role, right? Yeah, something like that. But I do think it would be a much longer book if one were to kind of do it properly. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. We'll park the question to Hans on the youth and the new, not an Arab Spring, but a transition spring, transition economy spring. Any other questions? And please say your name and where you work or what you work on.
My name is Roberto Segura. I'm a chief economist of Sigma Research, which is an investment private equity to investments in Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Crimea, and Bulgaria. And I have been with Sigma Research for 20 years with investments in these 4 countries. So I know these 4 countries very, very well. I was also a country director here at the World Bank, a technical director many years ago. And I was the head of the World Bank's office in Kiev, Ukraine, for 3 years. 94 to 98. So it was really at the very beginning, yes. He was my student, by the way, at ERC. So this was in the early 90s. I was teaching there. And the fact is that at the beginning, and I saw that, very clearly with our project, we had the idea at the beginning of the 1990s, when I became the chief of the office there, that the World Bank was going to lend $2 billion per year to Ukraine. That was the objective. We wanted Ukraine to become the second largest borrower of the World Bank. It didn't happen. It didn't happen, and I had to basically recommend that Ukraine could not basically assimilate $2 billion per year of World Bank lending. I think that what happens is that the government at that time decided to follow a preservation strategy to preserve all these high-intensive capital-intensive industries. And I went around talking to governments, talking to different places about the need to focus on medium-sized industries, because I had also worked in China from the very beginning, actually. And because I was at one stage a division chief for industry at the World Bank. And the response from from the Ukrainian, from the government at that time, is Ukraine is not going to be a banana republic. We want, just the large, heavy industries. And there was not really an intention to try to promote, to try to do something in terms of removing barriers to entry, barriers to exit, barriers to growth on the general small and medium industrial sector.
And the question? And the question is?
Well, the question is, where are these countries going now in terms of?
Thank you so much for the historic oversight as well. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Anush Bejanyan. I'm from Participant Manager in Social Protection and Jobs in the World Bank. So the question I have to Alek, have you? I fully, totally agree about the level, the institutional level before the transition started matters. Have you looked into 2-3 points that I always actually ask myself? The first one, the one that I ask myself always, why Estonia is where Estonia is, and why Armenia, where I'm from, is where Armenia is, especially in terms of high-tech technologies, etc., where the hope for Armenia initially was so high and hardly materialized. So there are a lot of underlying factors, that we all know, but has the historical factor mattered? That's what my question is for you, because Estonia joined the USSR much later than Armenia, and there could be an institutional aspect of it that actually helped that transition. So that's one question. And the second question is that I also ask myself, which I, having worked in Central Asia quite extensively, especially in Tajikistan and also in Moldova, quite extensively, the question I was asking again the same, why Armenia is where Armenia is and why Tajikistan is where Tajikistan is, and whether the fact that how the Soviet institutions were imposed in certain countries such as Central Asia, where the cultural and traditional aspects were so heavily suppressed at the beginning of the Soviet, and obviously the institutions did not evolve naturally, but rather actually were imposed much more strongly than in Estonia or Armenia, whether that factor plays a role in where the countries are now. And that is, I think, to say that I absolutely agree with you that every single of 29 so-called transition here are so unique that the bird view does not provide that, does not give you that unique look.
I'm going to take 2 more questions and then, yeah.
Really appreciate this approach because it goes deeper into history, what you proposed, and I think it actually defines where the countries are now, and also suggestion or maybe your opinion about do you think the political leadership in those countries were important, or how it impacted on the development? So why Belarus having the leadership became Belarus, like Otaviano said? Why Georgia did the leapfrog in the transition because of this? Also, to what extent the cultural values matters impacted? For instance, the unity of Poland being all Catholic helped it to faster integration in the European Union and unification of values, and other countries like Ukraine, which was split between three different churches, religions, impacted the emergence of the countries. And also important component about which Mr. Sakura just mentioned about the state of the economy in the early 90s. Probably Ukraine was the second largest economy after Russia in the early 90s, but when we look on the graph now, it's lagging behind, not even reaching the 89th level at the moment. To what extent the political elites controlling the capital in the country
preserved the growth and receiving 2 billion in the early 90s. So do you consider these factors to be important? Maybe it's a topic for the next research or expanding the research in your book. Thank you.
Yes, please go ahead.
I'm Marsha McGraw-Olive. I'm a bank retiree and working in this region for almost 30 years and now a professor at SAIS. I really love the historical view. I think it's fundamental, and I agree that there's a huge diversification that we see by country. But have you looked at political economy factors, particularly as they overlap with institutional development? And I'd take something simple like land rights. And you could not get in Russia privatized land for 10 years because they were communist blockage in the parliament, as one example, whereas in other parts of the former Soviet Union and the farther west, they had private farms, for example. So, in other words, these institutions have an historical factor, but there's also the political economy side, which is the relationship between the power of the state and the economy. Most widely seen now in parliaments where business interests are dominant in many of these parliaments, and they're just voting for what their own private interests. This is Ukraine and all through Eastern Europe. So if you take political economy as a kind of a causal factor, can you then project, will we see more institutional change given these where in many countries are rather frozen?
Thank you. The next version of the book will be thicker and thicker. It's, I would like to propose to first give the floor to Hans, also to reflect on the question on youth, but you can also broader. Then Otaviano to reflect on the questions that were asked, and I'll give you the famous last words. Yes?
Yeah, I think we cannot overestimate the role of young people and the youth. There's in the book a story about the brain drain and the role of the diaspora, where it's not automatic that you benefit back from the people who have emigrated. It's incredibly important. Why is it important? Because I think that these broad trends that we are talking about, the need to change, they often show first in generational divides. And the reason is that the new situation that requires changes, sometimes require even a different economic system, they first show up in the reality of the young people. The current development is a great example. The new technologies that are fundamentally changing the way labor markets are functioning, and in general the economy is functioning, that's already reality for the young people, while it's still not there for the older generations. And that creates an enormous tension. And I think also in the bank we are not focusing enough on that. There's an enormous political economy problem because it's the old people who are voting. They all want improved pension systems and some other things, and the young people feel that the system is not working for them. And in many Central European countries they go abroad or they are not voting anymore, and there's huge anxiety which leads to very extreme politics also. So I think it's incredibly important to look at it, and it's a kind of a way of zooming into a development that is still to come, but it's already there for the young people. On the tension, and that's my last point, between these overall trends that you're seeing happening everywhere, and then still the different paths of individual countries like Tajikistan, Armenia, and Estonia. The way I would like to look at it is there is, almost without exception, a general trend that requires change. And it is important to understand that trend for all countries. But then the speed at which countries are adjusting to something that in the very long run is inevitable depends a lot on the political economy, on culture, on institutions. And the fact that then the outcome, at least in the medium run, is different doesn't mean that the situation is fundamentally different, because they are all facing that same kind of problem that the existing system no longer works because we have these global trends that require adjustment.
Yeah, if I may, well, it doesn't surprise that an Armenian like him would deal with diaspora with that as a blessing or a curse and so on. But the point that I would like to make is the following. In fact, although I use the word inclusive versus exclusive elites and so on, it's almost the same as the political economy issue. My guess on what makes the difference between, let's say, the degree of technological development in Estonia and as compared, for instance, to Tajikistan, which I know less, but Kazakhstan, I went there a couple of times in my previous incarnation here, is the enabling or non-enabling outcome of what the elites do. Estonia paved the way so as to allow for some capillarity in society's ability to produce, to engage with technology. Whereas you go to other places in the Eastern Europe, and clearly the most important thing is to keep the control on the resource allocation. And that's where the difference takes place in terms of degree of development. In this sense, this political economy is a reflection of the kind of exclusive or inclusive elites that you have in this place. And I have the impression that the downfall of the Soviet empire gave the space for the local kind of elites exactly to spring up and get autonomy, for good or bad. So while the downfall and the opening of the 90s was superb for Estonia, because of the existing elites were of another nature, that was not necessarily in other case, like, let's say, Belarus. So we're on the same page on this. The results of the simplistic process taking place in the 90s and 2000s varied in their results depending exactly on the pre-existing kind of society that was there.
I'll try to be brief. Thank you for the questions and the interest. I will not go in order, but I will try to address every point. Well, what Otaviano mentioned and Hans mentioned, the general trend, I think I can only add to this, well, there's an interesting book. I'll start with the elites, because that's exactly the point that I make, and towards kind of the intensification of the let's call it independence movements in the late 80s and then through early 90s was really, yes, there was the sort of, I'm not a political scientist, so may sound a bit crude, but it was the response of the masses, but it was also the elites in the direction that they played an important role. And in that respect, I guess the next step should be logically an macroeconomic foundation to solidify whatever the new emerging system is. And Armenia is experiencing that right now. So there's a lot that can be said in terms of general change, institutional change, but there's a very severe and simple macroeconomic reality that has to be in place. I don't know why, but Estonia has some sort of effect on Armenians. It's the cloud that Armenians live in, and to compare Armenia to Estonia, since at least 2003, when was my first meeting here in the conferences, Armenia is not Estonia, and Estonia is not Armenia. We both Hans and Otaviano mentioned cultural, institutional changes. There's also a very simple one, geography. And the fact that indeed Estonia, I think Anushi mentioned that Estonia became part of the Soviet Union much later. This generational memory stays there, right? And the practices, right, stays there. But on top of everything else, these things are, again, quite visible. Estonia did not have a devastating earthquake. Estonia did not go through the war and does not remain with blockaded borders. So, and it is not landlocked. so these things have to be taken into account when we compare the two economies. And even if you compare Armenia to Georgia, there are differences there as well with the tourism and ports and transition zones that Georgia's territory serves. Again, these sound very mundane, but they play a big role in as explanatory factors. But then the whole belief, and I will get to some of the other questions, but the whole belief in the tech revolution and changes may be a bit misplaced. If in the case of Armenia, it's roughly, 3%, but I may be corrected on that, of the entire economy, and employs a very small share of trained people. So if indeed that is the goal that for some reason is decided to be achieved, then there has to be only one major investment, and that is in broader education. And it takes time for that to develop. But on the political economy, which I think addresses your question and your question in terms of where they're going, what I mentioned very briefly in my slide about the industrialization in Eastern Europe, part of that was forced, but part of it was also to win the Eastern European hearts in terms of the socialist model. And much of the agricultural system would remain still private, whereas in the Soviet Union things happened completely differently, collectivization and all that. And then it's the system self-preservation, right? And sort of kind of probably what you discovered later on. But where was your point? There's an interesting book that I read recently, and actually and I mentioned it in the book in relation to the elites, by Bas van Bavel, Invisible Hand. I may be confusing the name. And he talks about the changing institutions and how history starts with ancient Mesopotamia, then goes to the Italian city-states, then the lower lands, and so on, and how each of those examples would reach some sort of a peak of economic development. But it's the inability for the policy, I guess in modern language, policymakers, but the elites, to see the need to transform, to see the need to adjust. And I think that was one of the critical points that if we say it was inevitable, it was possible to avert and avoid this 1990s decline, if that question would have been addressed in the early 70s, maybe. But it was addressed in late 80s, and that was already too late because of as the general trend, the technological changes and the political changes were already going in a different direction. So where are they going? They're all going their own paths, I think. There are obvious geopolitical aspects to consider, and I think each country will try to carve its own place on the map, global economic map. So we'll see.
They're going the same path, but in different speeds.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for your questions and attention.
In Poland, it was addressed in the 70s.
Yes. But
when you saw the reforms trying to overcome
right.
the restrictions of the old system,
Yes.
and starting to provide consumer goods and